So today we're going to do a general introduction of this class. I have to set the background for what we're going to do, basically, right? It's we have to see, we're moving away from Western philosophy, and so I have to give a little bit of background on what I want to move away from, right? What this class is going to be criticizing before we can really understand the contribution, right, of the authors that we're going to be studying, right? So, okay, so remember I told you I conceived the class when we started to have a rise in xenophobic events in our country, right? This was especially targeting immigrants, but I've been thinking about it. And to be honest, our country has never been too friendly to the stranger. I mean, we're kind of a ambiguous animal, right? The United States of America. On the one hand, we have the Statue of Liberty, right? Saying, give me your poor, your oppressed, and so forth. And on the other hand, we have a history of oppression, right? So it's not just that we're against immigration. We have a history as a country of oppression to anyone who doesn't fit with who we think the standard American should be, right? We have even founded our country on the negation of the stranger, right? When we negate the Native American culture, when we negate their territory, right? This is already a great start. I'm being ironic, right? So we already founded our country on the negation of the other, right? So this is in our memory, right? This is in our collective memory, which we incidentally haven't yet processed, I believe, because to have processed it, we would have needed to do some kind of atonement, right? But we've never really acknowledged our wrongs, right? With regards to the Native American population. So our country is really based already on the negation of the other, right? Then of course you have slavery, right? A few hundred years of slavery, where again, we are seeing the other, right? They are this and that inferior. They are, supposed to be working like this, etc., etc. And when there's even the freeing of the slaves, we continue to push back, right? As a country, we continue to push back and not allow them in to the mainstream society, right? So up until today, right? If we're talking about systemic racism, meaning it's not blatant, it's not, a caricature, but it's still happening. It's still hard to enter certain spaces, right? I'm thinking just academia, right? Very hard to enter if you're not, right, Western minded looking and so forth, right? So this is already, right, in our history continues with that. Then we have, of course, the woman, right? For centuries trying to make a path for herself in this society, right, and so forth. So, and then now, of course, we have the immigration issue and so forth. So this is really, this problem of the stranger is not just about immigration, it's about race, right? It's about gender, it's about, and it's about immigration, right? So you can really, so it's a broad problem, which is a broad issue for us, right? This, in my view, this is the original sin of our country, right? We have, the original sin of our country is the negation of the other. And we take over, we supplant, and we possess, and we, in a way, push back the other to take over, right? This is really, in a nutshell, the original sin. I've often thought that the only way forward for us would be to really go back at one point and atone, right? There has never been, and I'm just so shocked to realize this, there has never been a collective asking for forgiveness to what we did to the Native Americans, to what we did to the Blacks, right? We have never really collectively acknowledged. And as long as we don't do that, it's gonna stay like a cancer and it's gonna eat away at our society, right? So I really believe that collectively we need to do this. It's not about white or Black. I really feel like we need to collectively as a country recognize that we, the people, right, have committed this atrocity in the past and try to repair it and offer reparations. Like I'm really into that. I really think that one of the ways forward for us to really heal our country is to offer reparations to the people we have wronged in the past. As long as we don't do that, our society will continue to be toxic and eaten away by this very undercurrent, kind of underground cancer, right? That is starting now to manifest, right? What we're seeing in the streets today is just a symptom, a tip of the iceberg of this horrible cancer that has inhabited the psyche of the collective psyche of this country, right? So this class really it's a wake-up call. It's meant to help us become aware of our original sin and help us get over it, right? Shift our mindset so we can begin to work towards a different society, right? Any questions on what I've said so far? Any comments before I get into exactly the philosophical aspects? Okay. All right, so this is really the what the class is based on. Now, so the main issue that we're going to talk about is this issue that comes up a lot, is that the other takes away from me something, right? Takes something away. This is why we always push back, right? We don't want women in certain positions, or we don't want minorities to, you know, take over, or we don't want immigrants, right? Because we always feel that they're going to take something away, right? This is the mainstream view with regards to the other. The other is always perceived as a threat. From the most ancient story of Cain and Abel in the Hebrew Bible to today, we are really conditioned to perceive the other as a threat, as someone who will take something away from me, and therefore I have to push back, right? I'll tell you a funny story happened to me on the beach. I always make funny encounters on the beach. Don't go alone to the beach. You'll end up making encounters like me. So I was on the beach enjoying myself. This old guy comes up and we start talking. And he asked me where I'm from. I said, I'm from France. And he's like, oh, yes. And he started looking at me like with compassion. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry what's happening to your country. And I'm like, what do you mean? I didn't notice anything going on out of the ordinary. He's like, yeah, all those Arabs, you know, taking over your culture. Like, I'm so sorry that soon, you know, French culture is going to be completely obliterated by the Arabs. And, you know, what's going to happen to the French way of life, right? What's going to happen to the croissant? So you know, clearly he didn't know who he was talking to, because what he didn't know, several things. First thing, he didn't know that half of my family came from North Africa as immigrants into France. So we were part of this immigration movement, right? Second thing, and this is a little known fact, but does anybody know where the croissant comes from? Culturally, where the idea of the shape of the croissant comes from?
No, actually, where's it come?
This is interesting. You will laugh when you find out. Anybody know? Which country invented the croissant, the pastry? Anybody know? Not India, no. So this is fun. Okay, so I'll tell you. The croissant was invented in Austria. It's an Austrian pastry. So this was during the Austro-Hungarian, this was way back, where they defeated the Turks at one point. And the Turkish flag, anybody know what's on the Turkish flag? The symbol? A croissant, yes. A crescent, we say, right? And so they made this pastry in the shape of a crescent to celebrate their victory over the Turks. And so the croissant actually is a Muslim symbol. So even the French croissant, right, has Arab roots, right? So you can't say it's going to take away, right? So anyway, so the main idea of the story is that he was hinting, right, that the population of the Arabs, the growing Muslim population in France was going to take something away, right? And this is a classic argument. But is it, right? Is it truly the case that the stranger takes away? And one of the main things I'm going to argue throughout the class is that the stranger doesn't take, he gives. He or she gives, right? The stranger doesn't take our identity. The stranger actually inaugurates our identity. Let me say that again so you can write it down. Yeah, by the way, just to give you a heads up on how I function when I grade the exams. And basically the best grade in the exam goes to whoever has the most detailed notes, right? So you want to make sure, as I'm talking in the class, because we won't have the exam until a couple of weeks, you need to make sure you take excellent notes. Everything comes out of my mouth goes on your paper, right? That way, when you answer the question, I can have a very substantial, detailed answer, right? So make sure you take very good notes. That's one of the things that will really ensure your success. So as I was saying, so let me say that again, right? One of the arguments I will make in this class is that the stranger doesn't take away our identity. The stranger inaugurates our identity. The stranger makes us who we were meant to be rather than takes away who we are, right? So that's one of the ideas, right, that will come up over and over again. Reason I'm doing this is really to help shift our perspective, right? As long as we see the stranger as a threat, we're going to push back. The day we see the stranger as an opportunity, we might be more welcoming. So it's not even about, oh, we should be loving and we should be ethical and we should be moral. No, it's the best way to become yourself is to be open to that influence, right? So we're going to talk more of that, right? But that's the main idea. Okay. Remember, you can interrupt me anytime with a question. You raise your hand virtually or put it in the chat. Okay. So
I can't find how to raise my hand for some reason on the computer.
Yes, you go to participants, you go to your name, and then you have the option to raise your hand right there. You see this? Okay. I saw a hand come up. Who was it? It disappeared just now. Who was the person just raised?
Hi.
Yes.
I have a question, Professor. So are we going to delve into the psychology of this issue?
We're going to delve into, how shall I put it? Not so much the psychology as the, what I said last time, we're going to look at what it means to be human, the definition of the human, the definition of the subject, and we're going to shift it, right? So in a way, of course, we're talking about psychology because this is consciousness, right? The subject is conscious, the subject is relational, the subject is rational. So yes, but I'm not going to bring in concepts from the realm of psychology. I'm going to deal with the issue philosophically. But yes, we're talking about what it means to be human, what it means to relate, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, so we'll be indirectly.
So we're going to touch on those topics as well, right?
Yeah, I imagine, right? So if we talk about relationality, we're talking about the psyche, right? So in that sense, yes. Good, okay. So let's go a little bit over where we come from as a Western society. Why, in a way, the US has been like this historically, just didn't come out of the blue. Remember, the pioneers who came to the West, they came from Europe. So it starts there, right? The mindset starts in Europe, right? Which the United States kind of exacerbated and played out, right, in our history. So let's go a little bit in Europe and see the little bit, how did we become so allergic to the stranger? Where did it start, right? I mean, you can trace the beginnings of this already in Greek thought, right? Not so much Plato, right? But the Greek culture, right? This idea that the stranger is the barbarian, right? They're not civilized, we are, right? So Plato is a little more open, but in Greek Hellenistic culture, you have this idea that, you know, we are the only civilized people and you guys are all, you know, you need to be civilized. So you have that already there. But in Europe, it really starts out, and I'm sorry to use him as a straw man, with Descartes, right? Descartes is really the one who crystallizes the European, the Western view of the subject, which then will become increasingly problematic. So let's go quickly over Descartes. If you recall, I would suggest quickly read, if you haven't read him, read the short version, the Discourse on the Method, right? If you want to go deeper, you can read the Meditations. They're a very easy read. You can read them in one evening, right? But I really suggest, he's the foundation for the course. So make sure you are familiar with this guy, right? Quickly read the Meditations or the Discourse on the Method, right? I'm assuming you know him already since this is Modern 2, and you should have studied him in Modern 1. Okay. So Descartes, in essence, remember how he proceeds, right? This is very important. So he starts by doubting everything. So he cast a doubt on the whole exterior world, right? And then he asks himself, what is the only thing I can be sure of? Does anybody know what is the pillar? What Descartes finds can be the truth that he can hang on to for sure? Anybody know? Yes, Allegra.
That he exists?
Exactly.
Or yeah.
Before he exists, he has something else. Exactly, Paul, right? I think, right? So he says, I'm not sure if any of this is real, but the only thing I'm sure of is I'm thinking, is that there is a thought and that I am thinking it, right? And so that's where he says, well, if I'm thinking, therefore I exist. So notice that he bases his existence entirely on himself, right? It's not, hold on, let me mute everybody because I'm hearing noise. Make sure you guys that you stay muted after you talk or you remute yourselves so we don't have the background. Okay, so he basically has himself determined his own existence. I mean, you have to wonder at the audacity or the chutzpah, right? It's better translated in that way, of someone going to base his existence on his own reasoning, right? There's an arrogance there, which, I mean, I don't want to say Descartes was an arrogant man, right? He wasn't. But this is something in the Western psyche. I can figure this out. Yeah, here's my first foundation, blah, right? And then from there, right, first foundation himself, which he has established by himself. Now he begins, of course, to prove the existence of God, and from there he proves the existence of the world, right? But everything is coming from him, right? This is the beginning of the problem, right? Make sure you write this down, that the beginning of the problem of the West, the pathology of the West is to be able to find yourself in isolation, and which is what Descartes did. Remember, he went away for this when he wrote the Discourse on Method, when he wrote Meditations. He left, he went and hid in the forest in a cabin. That's where he wrote, right, the Discourse on Method. So Descartes really, and this is a symptom of the West, is I can be myself, I can find myself, by reasoning, right? So, so when it comes to the human other, now it becomes even more problematic. So the first problem, make sure you write down, is the fact that the self in Descartes is entirely built by itself. Descartes is not arguing for his existence based on something else than himself. He is entirely finding his identity in himself. He's finding his being in himself. And this is a problem, right? Are we really able to do that? Is that the path forward, right? That I can become fully myself by myself. And of course, after Descartes, you have all of the theories of autonomy, independence, up until today in the States, where we have this idea that to be truly myself, I have to be independent, autonomous, self-made, right? So this is stemming from there, 17th century. I can do this by myself. The more independent and self-reliant I am, the more myself I am, right? And so then in such a context, by the way, it becomes absurd to share, right? Because if I can make myself by myself, if you come in the horizon, you're ruining something for me, right? You're gonna take away this thing I made, right? So do you see the issue? When you define the subject, when the subject is defined in isolation, immediately the other becomes an anomaly and therefore a threat. And that's the problem of Descartes, right? Parillo, go ahead. Parillo, you should unmute yourself.
No, that was an accident, my bad.
No question? Okay, Cosmidis?
So would you say that part of the reason that we also kind of fear the other, I mentioned it in the chat, but I didn't like really go into it, was that kind of idea that a lot of the times we only do things for our own self-sufficiency and our own self-gain, and a lot of people are really selfish, and so we fear the other and we believe that they want to take something from us because we tend to want to take from others.
Yeah, I mean, that already is an issue that we take from others. But even before that, right, I'm talking about something, a sickness which precedes greed. Before greed, there is autonomy, right? There is the sense that I can find myself in autonomy. At that moment, you don't need the other, right? So, of course, greed is an issue too, right? Which we'll talk about in a second, right? But even more basic is this notion that I can be, because greed, how are you going to tell the person to stop being greedy? You can't, right? But you can tell the person, you're not yet fully yourself as long as you're greedy. Now the person, you have their interest. Did you see my strategy? Cosmidis? Cosmidis,
yes.
Right?
Yes, I'm here.
Because what we're doing is we're preaching to these people. You know, this is the liberal discourse, right? We're very good at, you know, making people feel bad and being like, how can you be so, you know, inhuman and insensitive, and we need to help each other. And the person is like, why should I help someone? I built this, right? Remember Obama when he made a scandal, right? When he said that, right? Many people think, I built this. I don't need to share this, right? Why should I? Of course, if your definition of the self is autonomous and independent, and if you are able to find yourself apart from others, then why should you share, right? Nobody's going to all of a sudden become all Christian and share, right? You have to make a proper argument. And one of the purposes of the class is to show that, yeah, you think you built yourself, but actually you would be an even higher version of yourself if you knew how to share. This is really the thesis of the class. What I'm going to argue, I'm not going to tell people share. Right? I'm not going to tell people you should share your wealth, you should help people, you should think, you should not be selfish. It's not going to work because people are like, I'm not selfish, I'm just independent. Right? Why should I help you? Help yourself. Right? And we have a whole theory, by the way, in this country where we believe we shouldn't help each other because it keeps the others from helping themselves. So we keep them in a kind of dependent. So that's why in this country, in many sections of this country, we don't believe in helping others because we feel that that will be detrimental to their own self-growth and their own autonomy, right? But when we realize that true growth is always relational for them and for me, then we have an incentive to enter into relationship. Do you see what I'm saying? Otherwise, why should I help you? I'm not helping you. You should help yourself. But if we realize that in helping each other, we are helping each other's mutual psychic growth, emotional growth, spiritual growth, then helping has a whole different meaning now. It's not about me having pity on you. It's me becoming fully myself as I relate to you. Are you following this? This is really important. I want to make sure. Let me turn on the gallery view. Put your hand if you see what I'm saying. Right? That it's not, so this class is not going to be preaching like, oh, we should help each other and let's stop being so selfish, right? No, this class is going to say, it's going to argue that selfishness is not only bad for the person who is deprived of resources, it's bad for you. Because as long as you're selfish, you are a stunted version of yourself, because we only become truly ourselves in relationship. This idea is what is the guiding thread of the class, right? Okay, so going back to Descartes, right? So we saw already how first original sin, this idea that I can be myself by myself. This is not a good beginning, because then what's the point of the other? What the other becomes an obstacle to my growth, right? So that's the first thing. Now, second thing is what Descartes does with the human other. Right? So for now, he's talked about God. So he's established himself. Then he tries to talk about the existence of God. He talks about the existence of the external world, but he doesn't go into details as to the existence of the human other, right? What about the human other? Is Descartes going to build the human other, the others? And so you have the post-Cartesians who do this, and they're followed by people like Locke, like Husserl, and they come up with a famous argument by analogy. Yes, I'm ready that. There's a famous argument which begins with Descartes. I mean, Descartes is the stimulus for it, and then the neo-Cartesians take it over, and then people like Husserl develop it. It's simply this, right? So coming from Descartes, here I am, I exist. How do I know that this object in the world is another human being like me and not just a pencil or a walking, I don't know, cartoon, right? Anybody know how that works? The argument by analogy. Anybody come across it? How do I know that that person walking there is a human being and not a refrigerator or a car? Anybody know? It's a very simple argument. Really, no one knows? Okay, yes, you want to try? I saw a hand come up. King, was that a hand?
Yes, it was. If I remember right, if I would take a crack at it, it's that a thing exists or is defined by its parts, and that we don't have to understand like the whole idea of it, but like the some parts of it. And now I'm like trying to think of an example on the fly. But before you know lead me on, is this anywhere right in the ballpark?
Not yet. I'm not quite seeing where you're going yet.
I think
Alright, then I'll pass.
could I add something? Could I add something?
Go ahead, yeah, Delma.
Yeah, I only remember an example. I think the example that I've heard is that if a planet has oxygen or an atmosphere, then it's like the Earth, then it's possible that it also has life. And so in that way, that's the analogy.
That's the idea. That's the idea. Exactly. The argument by analogy is like this. We see a being walking around. They look like us. They talk like us. They have an outside behavior like us. And therefore, we assume, by analogy, we say, well, therefore, they must be inhabited by a consciousness like us, right? Let me say it again so you can write it down. The argument of analogy, right? In other words, we're trying to determine whether this being outside is human or not. How do I know? Right? If I'm Descartes and I've proved myself, I've proved God, I've proved everything exists, but how do I prove that that thing over there is a human being and not something else? The argument by analogy is this. Oh, that person looks like me, talks like me, walks like me, smiles like me, therefore like me. I'm now making an inference. They must have a consciousness. So I can't go look inside their brain and find a consciousness. I'm making an inference. How do you say that word? Inference? Where's the accent? Somebody please, American. Help me.
Inference.
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 They make an inference that they have therefore a psyche because they look like me, talk like me, walk like me. Makes sense. Everybody good? That makes sense? Let me see your hands. Okay, now, what's the problem with this argument? Anybody see the problem?
A lot of guesswork.
No, well, yes, it's guesswork, but there's an even deeper problem, King.
When someone looks different.
Okay, very good. What if the person doesn't walk like me, doesn't talk like me, doesn't look like me, then they're not human? This is the problem, right? This is the problem of the West. For them, somebody is human, i.e. on their level, if they walk like them, talk like them, think like them, smile like them, and if they don't, probably subhuman. Historically, this has been the reasoning, right? So the problem with the West is that they only recognize what is like them. If you're like me, then okay, we're at the same level, we're both human. But what if you're not like me? What if you don't talk like me, walk like me, feel like me, speak like me, and so forth? Then are you, and this has been the issue, right? So the argument by analogy, which has permeated Western thought, is deeply flawed, right? King, you want to add, or is that the hand from before?
It was after before I forgot to put it down.
Okay, very good. Okay, so then this leads me to the main issue. Oh, Osorio, go ahead. You want to add something?
Well, I just want to say that it's a very self-centered way of thinking, assuming that everything around you should be compared to yourself only.
Exactly. There is a deep, entrenched, and unconscious arrogance in the way the West has done philosophy for decades without being, criticized. The argument for analogy happened all the way to the 20th century with Husserl, right? You have it written out, developed in his Cartesian meditations, right? So you have this innate arrogance that I'm made by myself and you exist only if you resemble me. That's in essence, right? The West, not all of the West. Now I want to be careful because otherwise I want to be nuanced, right? Not all of Western thinkers think like that, right? You have variations, people like Kierkegaard, people like obviously Levinas, which we'll be studying, right? You have a number of philosophers who don't think like that, but in general, right? The tendency of the West, not only philosophically, but politically, historically, right? Is to say, I am myself by myself, and you exist only if you resemble me. Okay, make sure you write this down, right? I am myself by myself, and you exist only if you resemble me, and the roots are in Cartesian philosophy, right? Okay, there's a couple hands. Who are you?
So what did these thinkers have to say about women? Like the fact that biologically there seems to be two types of humans?
You're seeing the problem now, right? So for centuries, woman was inferior because she was different. Starting even back with Aristotle, right? Oh, different body temperature, therefore body temperature, right? That's the way he begins. We have a different body temperature, and therefore we are X, Y, and Z, and all of these are inferior, right? So, and we have done this with the Native Americans, we have done this with the Blacks, we have done this with the Asians, we have done this with women, we are doing it with animals, and, and with nature. Let's go there, right? So this is just because I can make myself, and therefore you exist only if you resemble me. This is, in my view, the original pathology of Western thought that the thinkers we're going to study are going to try to reply to, right? Respond to. Okay. Did I answer your question? Who were you actually?
Here.
What was your name? Sorry.
My name's Sarah Kang.
Kang. Okay, yeah. Did I answer your question, Kang?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. A couple more questions I saw popped up. Who are you? Who else had a question?
Professor, I do.
Go ahead.
I guess another way of also mentioning, like, you know, people not walking and everything to just increase how like messed up and wrong that could be is people that have like disabilities as well. People that aren't able to walk, people that aren't able to speak unlike everybody else and think like everyone else. Wouldn't that also make, with that idea in mind, just like if you don't walk like me, talk like me, wouldn't that make that they would think like you're less human like me?
Exactly.
That's clearly messed up and incorrect. Possibly.
Yes, it's messed up. What I'm basically saying, in case you haven't noticed yet, is that Western thought is inherently racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, etc., etc., etc. And this is the problem, right? Now, obviously, not all philosophers fall under that, but really that has been the trend, not only philosophically, but politically, as you know, through history, right? And this is what we need to move away from. We need to move away from this concept of the subject as finding themselves in isolation and seeing everyone as supposedly needing to resemble them in order to have some kind of dignity, right? Okay, a couple more questions. I see Kim, Perillo, Osorio, Cosmidis. If it's a question, speak up, otherwise put your hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry, quick question. Can you just repeat what you said before that you wanted us to write down?
What was that? Yeah, so the two flaws of Western thought is that the self can be made by themselves, right? And that the other exists only because they resemble me. The other has human dignity only because they resemble me as a human being. And so this thinking has its roots in Descartes, although Descartes doesn't go that far, but it has its roots there. And of course, we see the implication of this type of thinking. What if the other doesn't resemble me? And we have seen what we've done, right, with that discovery. Immediately, they don't resemble me, therefore they don't have the same dignity. They're subhuman or inferior and so forth, right? So this is why, right? So what I've tried to do right now is show the philosophical background of the way we have acted as a country, right? And so what I'm saying is we need to shift our perception of what it means to be a self and of what it means to be another. And then maybe we can move in a different direction, right? Good. Other question, the other, Cosmidis Pario, King?
I wanted to bring up, what about, because you're mentioning in the West, but isn't there kind of this idea of like just tribalism as in like a kind of a global way? I mean, it doesn't really kind of make sense now, but in a time period when people were like traveling around the world for the first time and seeing other people of other cultures and other parts of the world, it does make sense that from purely like a natural instinct standpoint, to be afraid of someone that doesn't look like you just because it's never been something that you've experienced and that could mean danger for people.
So you're saying it's a more general thing than the Western, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that is like an aspect. I mean, I do think that later when thought comes into it and communication comes into mind, people should not continue to be afraid of another human just because they're different than them. But I do understand like an innate fear of something that looks different from you if you've never seen something like that before. But if someone's just obviously a human,
right,
I don't know, that is like a different color, you're like, oh.
I would
don't know.
say yes and no. There's an ambiguity, right? On the one hand, we are afraid of the stranger, and it's true, you see this in all cultures to a certain degree. But on the other hand, we are also attracted to the stranger or intrigued. And the difference between our civilization and other civilizations is that we have emphasized more the fear aspect, whereas you have in other cultures the emphasis more on the hospitality aspect, right? So you have two different cultures in the world. You have the culture which emphasizes hospitality to the stranger, and you have many cultures like that. And then you have cultures which emphasize fear of the stranger. Sadly, well, we are ambiguous, right? We have to a certain degree a certain hospitality, but we also have fear, and the fear right now is growing, right? So that's why I'm addressing more of us, right? But you do have, yes, you can find this everywhere. Although some cultures have emphasized hospitality over fear. We'll see that the African culture is more of a hospitable culture, at least with the concepts we're going to study. The Middle Eastern cultures also, right? But obviously the West, well, I don't know if we can say the West has been historically a hospitable culture. I don't see it. Sorry. Parillo?
So my question was really just who was the philosopher that came up with the argument by analogy?
I have to look him up. It's a Neo-Cartesians right after Descartes, and I wrote it down somewhere, so I have to look it up. Can you email me that, please, that question? That would be great. Then I'll remember to respond to you. And then Husserl, of course, is the one who really developed it. That one I'm sure about. And he develops it in his Cartesian meditation. So he's developing Descartes' thought and into this, right? Okay. Wait, let's move on. We'll continue talking in a bit. Let's move on a bit. Okay. So second thing that I want to talk about, really briefly before I get into the introduction of all the philosophers, is simply this. One of the other contributions of the West is to define the subject not only in isolation, but as rational. Right? So this is another issue that we're going to look at, right? So if you recall, of course, Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. So it's my thinking which determines who I am. And then the West follows suit, right? When really we define ourselves as rational beings who are able to think, who are able to solve problems, the scientific worldview emerges out of that. Am I breaking out, guys? Can you hear me continuously? Put your hand in. Okay, because I feel like I don't know, I disappear sometimes. Okay, very good. Okay, so another thing, right, which in my view, which we'll see is deeply flawed, is this definition of the subject as rational, meaning as a thinking being who has, with the reason, control over the universe. Okay, so where we're going to move in this class is move away from the definition of the subject as rational to a definition of the subject as relational, right? So Aristotle says man is a rational animal. Someone like Levinas is going to say, no, man is a relational animal. What makes us typically human, different, is the ability to have compassion, right? So this is an interesting shift, right, that we'll be making. What Aristotle used to say, what makes us specifically human is our ability to reason. That's how we rise above the animals around us, right? And that's true to a certain degree, right? So of course we have emphasized this. So then we come around and we say, oh, because we are, as a country, very rational, we have a lot of technology, science, then we believe we are civilized, right? What people like Levinas are going to say is that the sign of civilization is not rationality, but relationality, right? How are you relating among yourselves? That's what is going to determine how civilized you are. And people have started talking like Levinas right after the war. I don't know how many of you saw the movie The Pianist. Let me see some hands. Anybody see the movie? Okay, so you have this Nazi officer, right, in the movie who meets a Jew who is an excellent pianist, right? And he's just world-class pianist. Now, what does the Nazi do with the Jew who is an excellent pianist? Anybody remember the movie? What happens between the two of them?
He saves him.
Exactly, saves him, right? So here in the movie, you're thinking, oh, what a nice Nazi, right? He's saving this Jew and so forth. And so we're noticing in the movie that the Nazi is not so much touched by the Jew, than he is by the Jews playing, right? The Nazi is thinking, what talent? The universe needs this rationality. So he saves not the Jew, but the talent, right? And so this is what we're seeing, the flaw, the deep flaw of the German society at the time, is that for them, the sign of civilization is rationality. Remember, the Germans were the heads of Europe. They were on top in everything before they became Nazi, right? They were on top intellectually, spiritually, poetically, musically. Everything was happening in Germany, right? And yet, Nazism was born there. So Levinas, who's coming out of this, of Nazism and is criticizing Nazism, is going to be saying, clearly, what makes a civilization civilized, it's not rationality, because the Germans had a very high degree of rationality. They were artists, writers, philosophers, reformators, and so forth, right? Reformers, sorry, right? And yet, that society sank into barbaric evil, right? So Levinas is moving away from the definition of civilization as reason, as rational, to what makes us civilized is our ability to relate, right? We're moving away from the rational animal to being a relational animal, right? What makes us truly human is the ability to feel compassion for another human being. It's not the ability to build an airplane, okay? That's the idea. What do you mean, Cosmidis?
I was just wondering if it had anything to do with like, so social solidarity, and then anime is like, social solidarity is like when individuals feel like they belong to their community and they feel like they're a part of it, like the community as a whole is better. And then when individuals feel isolated from their community, and there's anime, like the situation is like, if the functions are not being carried out by the society, then if the people feel like they're not a part of a whole, and then the functions are not being carried out in society, like kind of reaches like disrepair.
Yeah, very good. This is in response to the other question, I don't remember your name, who asked if we were going to do psychology, right, in the class. So this is, you're giving, so I hope he's listening, right? You're giving him, you're rephrasing what I just said in psychological, sociological terms, right? So everything I'm saying obviously has been explored, right, by psychology, by sociology, right? But I'm giving you the philosophical version of it, right? Okay, yes, so I agree. Yeah, absolutely what you're saying, Cosmidis, is exactly what Levinas is going to be saying. Okay, any questions on anything I said before I go into a quick summary of each of the philosophers that we studied? Questions? Okay, so let's begin briefly with Kant. So we'll start with Kant. Modern to you is based on Kant, so I have to start with there. But I also chose him because even though he sounds very, you know, Western in the sense that we've been talking about, he actually is moving away from that. It's interesting. Kant is much more progressive than we think. We're going to see actually that for Kant, what defines us as human is not what he calls our understanding, but our reason. Right? Let me distinguish between the two, right? So Kant is going to redefine what reason means, and make sure you catch that, right? Because otherwise you'll misunderstand. Kant says there's two faculties that we have: understanding and reason. So understanding for Kant, we're going to talk about this, right? But understanding is our ability to figure things out scientifically, technologically, knowledge. Understanding is knowledge, okay? Understanding is the part of us which is seeking knowledge. Now, reason is something completely different, right? Understanding, the way Kant talks about it, is the way that Aristotle talks about reason, okay? When Aristotle says man is a rational animal, he means man is a thinking, understanding animal. So Kant is going to talk about that rational faculty and call it understanding. Then he's going to bring up the word reason, which for him is not a thinking thing, it's more of a sense, a moral sense, right? So at least that's how I'm going to define it, right? So for Kant, reason is the voice of your conscience. It's not the voice of your intellect, but it's still happening in the same area, right? So reason is the voice of your conscience. And what we're going to see with Kant is that for Kant, what makes us human is not so much our ability to solve problems, than our ability to sense, right, when something is morally right and when something is morally wrong. Okay, so notice how Kant is already doing the shift. Anybody see? Right? He's shifting away from man is a rational animal to man is a relational animal. Because for Kant, what truly makes us human is our moral sense. The sense that this is right, this is wrong. This is the highest level of our humanity for Kant. It's way above the ability to solve problems, right? So we're going to see with Kant, and it's fascinating the way that he situates morality at the heart of what it means to be human. To be human for Kant is not to be intelligent, is to be moral, right? And so you already have at the heart of Kant's definition of humanity, this relationality, right? To be moral is, and we'll see in Kant, to be moral is to be aware of, or not so much aware, but to be moral is to be, how should I put it? Is to take a stand for someone else's dignity, right? Of course, we'll go into all those details, right? But in essence, morality is the ability to be sensitive to and to take a stand for someone else's dignity when it's in danger, right? So Kant is really already moving away from the Western concept of the subject as autonomous and rational, right? To a subject which is moral, right? And relational. So that's the first step we'll be taking with Kant. Of course, we'll go into a lot of details. Then we'll study Buber. Any questions on Kant really quick before, I mean, of course, we'll go into details. So, okay, then we'll go to Buber, who is philosophizing right before, let's see, 1923. He's philosophizing right before Hitler comes to power, right? He's in Austria, but it's the same thing. Remember, first place Hitler invaded was Vienna, right? So he's already in the shadow, right, of the Holocaust, and he's writing the book that we're going to study, I and Thou, right? And there he's going to be talking also about something very important, which is still pertinent today in my view. He's going to talk about the Western view of relationships, right? And he's going to diagnose the Western approach to relationships as being always somewhat either a relationship of knowledge or a relationship of use, right? When we relate, we either want to know or we want to use. This is the Western mindset. I mean, and you can see that. You can see this historically, right? The West is excellent in science and technology, wants to know. And the West is also excellent in exploitation and oppression, wants to use, right? Those are the two sides of the Western rationality, right? Either we are, so I mean, you know, we are glorious and decadent at the same time, right? The West, we're at the one hand, we're trying to know and explore and understand. On the other hand, we are exploiting, we are taking, we are, right? We are invading, we are conquering, we are dominating others, right? So this is the two heads of Western rationality. And Buber is saying we need to learn, we have forgotten, he says, how to relate to human beings as human beings and not just objects of knowledge or objects of use, right? And that's where he's going to go, trying to help us rediscover a way of relating to each other which avoids this kind of this kind of this way of doing that the West is used to doing. Either I know or I possess. I know or I possess. Yes, good question. I'm gonna put the origins of the West in Europe, but then oh wait, let me rephrase the question for those who didn't hear. So King asked, give us a definition of the West outside of geography. The West begins in geographical area of Europe, right? So the whole mindset there, starting with Descartes, you can even trace it to the Greeks, like Aristotle, right? And then, of course, the West spreads to the United States. This is the same mentality, right? And it conquers those who don't look like it, right? So the West has a geographical beginning, but it does spread. And now you're seeing this Western mindset spreading all over the world. Individualism, self-reliance, right? Isolationism, protectionism. This is all kind of, in a way, spreading, right? So I guess that's how I would define. Does that answer your question, King? King, react, please. Say yes, no, yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, now moving to Levinas. Levinas is now a little later than Buber, also thinking now right during the Nazi era, right? He is, of course, we'll talk at length about his connection to Nazism, but he is really going to be focusing on, I mean, Levinas is really a philosophy of the stranger. He's really the one who really developed very deeply the need for the West to shift its concept of the subject from rational to relational. I'm getting these ideas from him, right? In other words, he is the one who begins to criticize the West and finds in the West the seeds of the Holocaust, right? So he's actually going to say the Holocaust was not an accident. It has philosophical roots, and we need to respond and address these roots if we're going to really prevent another Holocaust, right? So he's saying it was a Western mindset, philosophical mindset, which gave rise to the Holocaust. And so we have to move away from that mindset, from that definition of the subject, to another definition, one which is less allergic to the stranger and more in tune with the stranger. So we'll talk about that. So one of the main contributions of Levinas is really going to show that we reach our true humanity in contact with the stranger and not outside of that contact. So he's going to really, really be the anti-Cartesian, right? Then we'll go to Shati with his introduction on African philosophy. And there we will meet a very interesting concept called Ubuntu. Anybody know what that means, Ubuntu? Anybody encountered that concept before? Really? No one? Sounds familiar? Okay, great. I have King saying it sounds familiar. Delmas, you know what it is? Okay, tell us. Yeah, it's an operating system. That's true, Khan. But it's based on the African concept. Delmas, do you know what it is? You said yes. Okay, thank you, Hugh. Hugh knows the answer. She took a class with me before. Delmas, you want to add to what Bella said?
I can't remember from the top of my head. Wow.
That's okay, Delmas. We'll let Bella help you. Bella, speak up. Tell us what you mean.
Oh, okay. Just that as individuals, we're only fully ourselves in relation to others.
Yeah, excellent. Right. One of the most famous quotes in the context of, or one of the meanings of Ubuntu is "I am because you are," and we're going to look at that, right? How it plays out, not only philosophically in the African context, but politically. This will be interesting. So this section is actually really interesting. We're going to not only notice a different way of being human, but we're going to notice a different way of engaging in society, a different way of doing politics, very different from the Western approach, right? So this will be very, very interesting to explore. And of course, we have to, it's going to be, this section is always the most difficult to teach, this section on African philosophy, because it's so remote from what we're used to. And also their way of arguing is different than our way. And so a lot of us become frustrated, like, what? How can they say that? So we actually, to enter that section, we actually really have to shift, right? And allow, and be hospitable, right? To a new way of thinking, a new way of arguing, right? And this is sometimes difficult for philosophy majors, right? So this section will be also very interesting. And then we'll close with the Irigaray, who of course will come from the feminist perspective, right? Of course, by the way, the African philosophy is going to be coming from the post-colonial perspective, right? This is a post-colonial criticism of the West. This is a criticism from the stand of having been an oppressed race, right? That's the social position from which these thinkers are philosophizing, right? Here we are, we were the other of the West, we were inferior to the West, and now here's what we have to say to the West. So this can be the basis for excellent philosophy of race, right? So if you're interested in racial relations, whatever we're gonna learn in that section, I think is a good foundation, because we're going to learn, first of all, how in a way one recovers one's dignity, when one has been oppressed and denigrated, but also how does one re-engage with the oppressor? And here we have a lot to learn, right? This is very interesting, the way that Africans re-engaged once they affirmed their own value and dignity. How did they re-engage, right? At least with the writers, as with regards to the writers that we're going to study, how do you re-engage with the oppressor? So we can learn a lot here as to how to heal our own racial issues in this country from the way that they healed theirs, right? The two authors we're going to be studying are Senghor in Senegal, and of course Shoti in South Africa. And both countries were dealing with, you know, racism, apartheid, and so forth. So there's a lot to learn from them as to how we as a country can address the racial problem, right? So this will be interesting. And then finally, okay, back to Irigaray. So here we have, of course, a woman's criticism of the West, right? And I mean, of course, women are Westerners too, right? You have Western women, but it's a special position because even within the West, the Western woman has a hard time, and then let alone if you're not Western, it's even worse, right? But it is difficult for a woman even today, right, to be a woman and to have a place in society. It's difficult. You often have to, as a woman, sacrifice part of yourself in order to, quote unquote, make it, right? In other words, society is not friendly, is not hospitable still today to a woman's contribution, right? If women are going to contribute, they have to fight, they have to rage, and they have to sacrifice. This is not normal, right? So that's the idea. So she's going to be talking about the sign of true civilization for Irigaray is going to be the ability for men and women to partner together, right, in a serious way, not just in a sexual way, right, in a socio-political way, right? So that will be interesting to see how she's actually one of the local, kind of, she's a more, what's the word? She's a less virulent feminist. She's not as aggressive as most feminists. She's talking about cooperation. And for her, the sign that we've reached civilization is when we have really an equal representation, gender-wise, on all levels of society. So we'll talk about that, how she makes that argument. Feminist philosopher is Irigaray, one of the books you have to buy. Okay, any questions on anything I said?
Just a quick question. When we speak about Irigaray with the last part of it, do you think you'll also be focused on like care ethics and touching up on like that type of philosophy when that was going around as well?
So yes, she is part of the second wave, which is also where care ethics is part of, right? Somebody like, I think it was a Gilligan who was part of care ethics. These are second wave philosophers who emphasize the difference of the woman, right? Unlike the first wave who emphasize how women are supposed to be like men. Let us, right? We want to vote, we want to work, right? But second wave is emphasizing women are different. So the care ethics arose out of that, saying that women have these abilities, right? And so, but at the same time, we're different yet equal, right? So Irigaray is saying we need to, even though we don't think like you, feel like you, we want to have a place by your side, right? Basically, that's how she addresses men. So she doesn't go specifically in care ethics, but she does align herself with the second wave, which is where care ethics is emerging, by saying we are different, we celebrate our difference, and our difference is needed to create balance in society, right? Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah.
What's your name? Sorry. Where's your name? Where's your name? Oh, Saint-Just. Okay, got you. Okay, very good. Okay, so you see, very exciting. We're going to be studying all the subversives, right? It's going to be very interesting to really see a little bit of non-Western philosophy, right? I mean, it's so sad the way that in most philosophy programs, right, what is required, and you look at the race and everybody's the same gender, same race. So it's important, I think, at one point in the philosophical journey to see how other people do philosophy, because there exist variations, alternatives to Western philosophy who are just as serious, just as rigorous, just as profound, right? Now, obviously, Western philosophy is very profound and serious and rigorous, but it has blind spots. This is my issue with it, right? I'm not going to say now the West is trash, Right? No, that's not what I'm trying to say in this class, right? The West has contributed a lot, spiritually, philosophically, scientifically, but the West has blind spots. And that's why we need to bring non-Western philosophers to cover those blind spots and move forward in our civilization, right? This is another argument, by the way, why we need to have more diversity in academia, because as a Western professor, I have blind spots as to what should be taught, how to teach it, right? And this is another issue that we are right now talking about in CUNY, the importance of diversity in academia. Why? And one of the reasons I would argue is the blind spot of any culture monopolizing the conversation. You're not going to see certain things. That's why you need a diversity of perspectives so you can have a bigger picture of what's going on, right? Okay, well, that's my private battle. Okay, any other questions? Good. All right, so we'll call it a day. I'm gonna, like I told you, I'm gonna switch around the syllabus. I'll put an announcement when everything is changed. And your next time we don't have an assignment yet because we'll be simply introducing Kant, right? So you're on vacation the whole week. So on Wednesday, I introduce Kant. You still have time to get all your books. And only next week, you'll have your first reading assignment. So you should be good. All right.